Hello boys and girls, I'm back with a new video and today everything is different because for the first time I'm not alone on this channel anymore. I have found some friends. Look at those two guys. I've got two dear colleagues and friends here. Let me introduce them to you. We've got a metal producer from Sweden that I'm sure you all know. One of the greatest metal producers. So hejsan till Örebro. Welcome Jens Bogren.
Hej Kohle, hur mår du?
Jag mår jättebra, men jag är också lite törstig, så skål.
Skål. I don't know if you guys know that, but Kohle's mother is actually Swedish, so that's why I like him.
And he usually doesn't like Germans that much, but half of me is an exception.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me introduce the other guy. So we also got someone from the United States. You can see it's already dark over here, and I mean in Sweden it's always dark, right? We also got someone from California where the sun is shining. My dear friend and partner from Produce Like a Pro, Warren Huart. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's interesting, as you say, from the United States. I'm like, oh, wow. I suppose I am technically now from the United States, but I'm still a European at heart.
It just sounds so fancy, you know, to have like two continents, transatlantic, and 3 countries in one Skype call. So I felt like I have to say that.
Yeah, and it is a beautiful day. I can't complain.
And a beautiful night over here.
I prefer the rainy, misty Sweden to sunny LA any day.
He's a true Viking.
He's a true Viking. But I understand. We do miss seasons every now and then. You're like, But the great thing about California, as I'm sure you're aware, is you can, well, you used to, not at the moment, but you jump in a car and drive for 3 hours and go skiing.
Oh, that's true.
That's nice.
The drawback is that you jump into the car, drive 3 hours to go and get 1 liter of milk as well. So. But I bike to work every day, actually. I have my house like 5 minutes from the studio. So there's at least one upside to being in Örebro.
I can't complain, though. My commute is, I live just off Mulholland, and my studio's just off Mulholland, so I drive on Mulholland every day, which is, if you know that road, it's really famous, so you get to see the whole of the city and just drive. I can't complain.
That is my favorite movie, by the way, Mulholland Drive.
I was just gonna say, every time someone mentions Mulholland Drive, I always think about lesbians, but I don't know.
What can you do? Yeah.
What can you do?
Great movie. Great movie.
I think if he mentions tea, he thinks about lesbians as well, or beer, but you know.
Anyway, too many jokes already.
Why are we here?
As you might know, the 3 of us have been the judges on a great mixing contest, a metal mixing contest, and we just did a video together where we announced all the winners and where we were showing all the winning mixes. And as you can see, we had so much fun that we just felt like we should continue this conversation. And that's why we're back on this channel today to talk about mixing metal and why Germans are the best metal mixers, of course. So my first question is, so we have seen that a lot of people got really creative. I think we had close to 2,000 mixes sent in, and they were all really creative. Some great sounding mixes by some people with a lot of talent. Some rather creative mixes, but we also saw a lot of people who struggled and had some problems. So my first question, maybe to Jens, is mixing metal more difficult than mixing other genres? And if yes, why?
Well, that is a good question, but I mean, I can tell you from experience that if some of the, the best or some of the good metal mixers that I know approach a pop mix, they can usually, do a pretty good result out of that. But I have seen some pop mixers try metal, and it is a different mindset, and it usually ends up, pretty disastrous. And there are some really good examples as well. I don't know if I should mention any bands here. I probably shouldn't do that, but that tried to use like high-end rock mixers, you know, the most expensive dudes in the business. And that's
oh, I know. I'd love to hear.
I think I know.
I think I know who he might be talking about as well.
It's considered almost to be a joke how that turned out. So it's yeah, it is very hard to mix metal, but it's also
because I have the same impression, but that's maybe only because I'm a metal guy. So I have the same impression that each time a non-metal guy makes a metal mix, it sounds wrong. But maybe, you know, maybe I just feel like doing a good pop mix or doing a good jazz mix, and, you know, the pop people will just laugh. I don't know. So let's ask Warren. He might be more neutral here.
No, I think possibly, I'm going to pose this to you guys, since this is entirely your genre, possibly somebody who would be really good at mixing massively dense EDM might be good at mixing metal, and vice versa. A metal mixer could probably nail, like, I'm talking like slamming EDM tracks. I think pop sensibilities definitely not, quite frankly. And from a classic rock background, I have to really think differently if I'm handed something metal. But I wonder, I don't know, you know, like a really dense, if somebody gave you like 100 tracks of like massive EDM, don't you think you could apply some of the techniques that you do in metal and also make that a massive slamming track?
At least I think what we are used to is having this wall of guitars, which is more or less some kind of filtered pink noise, you know, that is like covering everything. And I always, as a metal mixer, I always feel like my main work is fighting those guitars. You want to have those guitars heavy, and then you want to make everything else, you know, find its place somewhere in between those guitars. You know, it sounds like two trains passing at the left and the right all the time, and then you have to add stuff to that mix. Yeah, so maybe that helps for other dense sounding arrangements or styles.
It's possible,
Jens?
but from my experience when mixing electronic stuff, I think those sounds are much easier, you know, because they are not so random when it comes to phase and frequency. So they sort of, you can mix them in so many ways, and they would, you know, still sound good. Whilst when it comes to those metal mixes with guitars, it's only so much, you sort of have a window that you need to to pass there in a little different way than other genres, I would say. I could also give you an example. I had this this guitar player from a really good metal band that's also doing some you know, home mixing, and he was calling me and say, you know, how is it done? I have this really good sounding drum kit that I just been doing this really nice mix on, and as soon as I start, you know, putting my guitars on, the drums sound shit, but they are not sounding shit. They are sounding good. I can hear that they are. And that's a core problem that I see a lot of people do, that they start to solo listen stuff, you know, and start to mix that up and then sort of make a drum sound, and then they start to add these elements. But the key thing when you mix metal is to always have those guitars there. I always do that. I mean, I never start mixing unless I at least get some sort of sense for the song first and get guitars up. Even if I'm about to reamp them, you know, in a few hours, I put whatever is there. If I just have DIs, then I put some simulation on, so that I have something. So I put on those two trains before I start, you know, crafting my drum sound. And that way I can make the right type of choices faster than if I would sort of get used to the drums without guitars, and then it just sounds, you know, what was a nice acoustic drum kit, you can hear the room or whatever, you know, nice crack in the snare, just sounds like farts as soon as you add those guitars.
I think it was part of what I was saying though, is I almost feel like a really great metal mixer might be somebody, if you've got a really dense EDM track, go to a metal mixer. They'll probably know how to get it to be powerful and slamming.
I'm sometimes a little jealous because I feel like in other genres, in pop music, in electronic music, there seem to be a lot more directions where you can go, whereas metal seems to be a lot more limited due to those guitars. You know, I just mixed like a vintage rock band today, and it was really like, hey, I can do like a mono drum sound with only 3 mics, or I can go, you know, more modern and more whatever 25 mics, or I can make it roomy or more dry, or there are like a lot of ways where this can go, or it can go lo-fi or whatever, you know. Whereas in metal, it might be only me, but I feel more limited.
Can I pose a question to you guys? Because I feel like there's 2 components in metal mixing. From listening to those thousands of tracks, I feel like there's 2 components, and they both have to be equally important. And that is attitude. It has to sound like, you know, exciting, super exciting, and then married with the technical. And you know, and that was something that came across for us, was the low end, how very few people, frankly, got the low end right. They couldn't get that bass to support the guitars. That was a big differentiator on the mixes we were listening to. But there was a couple people who got the low end right, but it was like, kind of pretty, kind of nice. It's like, it's getting those 2 things. I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but for me, that's what I was sort of listening for. I was like, is this really, really exciting? And is it technically good?
I think today, like, metal has become cleaner and cleaner and cleaner, like, over the years, and actually better sounding, but maybe also a little more boring sounding. So what I'm trying to do most of the time, and that is, I think, the hardest part, is trying to find that combination of like transparency and like a technical high level, but on the other hand, you shouldn't forget that metal should have some kind of rebellious feel to it, you know, some kind of aggression in there, and that balance is, you know, it's pretty difficult to get right. And of course, then again, it depends on the metal genre. If you're doing whatever, brutal death metal or hard rock, you know.
Absolutely, but there are also exceptions here. I mean, it's not like there is like one mix or style that is right. If you can look at thrash bands that are, you know, super technical, super clean, sort of Andy Sneap school, and then you could check out something else like Slayer, which is completely the other spectrum, right? You know, wrong hits on the drums and out of time and out of tune stuff, and that could be equally good, you know, as for the audience. And well, I've said that for many years now, that I think the technology has taken us too far, you know, in one ditch with people are, I see that all the time, stuff that I get in for mixing and where people are producing and they think it's sort of, they think it's a standard that you have to grid everything and that you have to auto-tune everything, even though it sounds, you know, completely idiotic when you can hear the auto-tune if it's not like an actual effect, in my opinion anyway. And then when everything is quantized, you don't, you know, you cannot sense movement in the drumming anymore because it's so, it's almost like it's getting less tight because it's so tight, if you know what I mean. And then you start replacing the drums, and soon every fill-in sounds like a machine, and you might as well have programmed the drums. And yeah, for me, it gets disconnected from what music is about a little bit. So, and you know, I'm also sort of, I'm not free of guilt to those things. I've also been in that ditch, you know, but at least I'm trying to sort of have a sense here, you know, where it sounds like, try to use the technology where you sort of make it sound like it's really good musicianship and not an edited product, so to speak. And I think in the long run, when history is going to judge your productions, you will last longer if you're able to, you know, maintain what's actual musicality and the actual core of the music in there. So I know there's a lot of home producers who completely misses those marks, or even don't even think that way, because everything they listening to are so just, you know, constructed or edited. And well,
don't you think that's first of all, I think one of the things I took from that, which is really important, was the admission, because I totally understand. You have to go through it, don't you? You have to like overdo it to realize, oh, that doesn't work, I shouldn't have done that. I think a lot of people just react to thinking correcting something is wrong. And I remind them that, you know, some of my old friends made records in the 70s and told me about how they used to cut tape to get things tight, how they used to like fly in the mid 70s samples from old digital delay lines and then have to realign them with SMPTE, and what a nightmare it was. We've always fixed things. We've always tried to create something great. It's just when the tools are abused, when you rely on them. But I do think for a kid, when they're coming up, what they're doing is they're learning a set of techniques. And I think it's okay if you're young, and I'm sure you guys do as well, and you're young and you're working out how to actually tighten things up. You've got to learn them, and then the skill comes where you're at now, Jens, and you're explaining, is that ability to know when to do it and when not to do it.
And that is difficult sometimes. I mean, I agree with everything that Jens just said, and I've been there as well. I think we're all guilty of doing that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I feel like if I look at metal productions 10 or 15 years ago, I think we are at a point where things are so perfect, that it can't get, let's say, technically better anymore. So people start looking for attitude again. That's what I'm doing. I think that's what the whole scene is doing overall. So, and also because every bedroom producer can buy some samples and can buy some Kemper presets and can, get some kind of middle of the road, boring metal tone these days. So people are not looking for perfection that much anymore, or let's call it technical perfection, but for attitude. And that's what I'm also trying to do on my YouTube channel. And that's what I'm trying to teach people, is to just try something else. I'm constantly trying to combine different types of distortion. I'm looking for new gear for other guitar speakers, other guitar amps. I'm trying gear that is not usual. And I'm actually using the YouTube channel to be able to do that, to experiment, because that's what keeps things interesting.
Yeah, no, that's true. I guess the problem is to, move away from perfection and find attitude and find artistic expression and still make it sound good. we just listened to 2000 mixes confirming that that's pretty hard. So,
but I have to say, it also depends on the genre. I mean, I think what's important is if you listen to whatever Architects or Bring Me the Horizon, those are great productions, but they have nothing to do with a band playing, That is like so far away from the idea of a rock and roll band, but I still love it. The problem is that kind of producing has taken over the whole metal world more or less, and for certain genres, it's poisonous.
No, we had just in a general music conversation. So we did a panel at Summer NAMM like 2 years ago, and there was like 8 producers of all different genres all sitting together, talking about this very thing. And the conclusion we came to is one of the problems, or realities, how about that? Not problems. One of the realities is a lot of the teaching goes to the lowest common denominator because it's easier. It's easier to teach somebody to like edit and use some samples and use, buy my, my amp sim or whatever it might be and use this. It's easier to do that because we all know you'll get a really good result. You won't get something that somebody goes, oh my God, that's fresh, that's new. Who is that guitar player? Wow, that drummer's amazing. That song's incredible. You won't get that, but what you'll get is a really good professional sound. And I think that's a big part. It's more difficult to teach and produce properly. It really is. It's more difficult. I'm sure you guys both deal with it. You get a guy in the studio and you work him. You work the guitar part. You sit there and go, yeah, that's cool, but if you could just be late on that slide, it's going to feel so much better. But it's just easier to get them to play it twice, and then just take the DI printed track and go grid, 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 and there it is. And maybe sometimes that's okay because you need it, because you want it to be and why spend an hour just punching in things that can take 2 seconds? But you see what I'm saying? It's like sometimes the laziness spills over and that becomes to a detriment, because it's easier to teach that. It's easier to do that because it will get you a professional result, but it won't get you something that we're all freaking out about. It's not Lemmy, it's not Motorhead, it's not Ace of Spades. It's not something that we all just go, wow, that still sounds dangerous. Put on Ace of Spades, it's still effing dangerous. And it will be forever.
I think that is something you cannot teach at all, because if a producer or a studio has a certain sound, that's just because that person has that attitude or has, it's nothing you can really teach. I think what you can teach, and that's also something I'm trying to do, is people to stay open-minded, to not just try to copy someone else. That is very important. That's what I'm saying all the time. It's like, this is how I do it, but feel free to try something else. That is so important, because I want to be surprised by, young engineers in metal doing something, whatever, completely different. I don't even have to like it, but you can only teach the technical part. And I agree that most metal recording schools also really concentrate on that part, and that also leads to production sounding more and more clinical.
That's true. And it is hard. I mean, it also comes from experience, because we all have been doing this for a long time. I mixed my first album in '96, and I've been pushing people in the studio ever since. And you just learn these things, by heart. And if one of my assistants comes in and I ask them to, can you track this guitar here? And then you come back, it's like, yeah, but, what about this part here? How did you... it's like, it's something you learn from doing it a lot, how to performance produce, to be able to keep track on, proper timing, tuning. I always tune the guitars for my clients, for example, because I don't think they can do it properly themselves. And all these things, and what you described there, Warren, with to spend extra time on that slide and stuff, that is definitely stuff that matters to me. You can ask any of my clients, they will never come back here because they hate me always afterwards. No, but seriously, it's for me, that is such an important part, and that sort of mindset comes from doing it a lot, and that is hard for the type of bedroom producers perhaps that work mostly with themselves, with all the instruments. Then you don't really perhaps get that musician interaction part the same way, even though you can of course spend 100 hours on your own slide and make that work. But
I mean, I consider it part of our duty as producers to help and educate the artists we work with.
Yeah.
Totally. But on the other hand, there's one advantage that the bedroom producer has, because if, like we all do or did, like if you work on, like in the business, if you are doing record after record, and you have, certain schedules, and you have bands coming from other countries, and there's a lot of stress, and you have deadlines and all that stuff, there is a certain tendency to be a little less risky. That's what I've experienced. And if you are that bedroom producer, you can just experiment. You can do crazy things because no one is expecting something. And that is a big advantage. Another reason why very often the debut album of any band is the greatest, because they had enough time, to write the greatest songs. Mm-hmm. But then they are under pressure, and there are certain expectations, So that's what I've experienced. Sometimes it's easier to come up with a unique sound with a young band because, nobody's expecting anything. And then if you have a band that is successful in the business, everybody's looking at their sales. How did the last record go? How is this one going? And then people have a tendency to play safe. And do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. And especially if you're on a release schedule, I mean, you sign for a certain amount of albums and you go on tour, and then you're supposed to have time to write the songs, and perhaps you prefer, having a few laughs and a few beers on tour instead of sitting in the bus writing songs. And then you come home, you have a family perhaps, and then suddenly there's time. These are the months where we need to write the songs because we're supposed to release a new album. Of course, that is not good for creativity at all. So I guess that's where professional songwriters come in.
Yeah.
No, but also when you talk about the sound, it's always, I hate it when people just pick the most successful record of that genre and tell me to get that sound. That's just the most, I mean, even if it sounds great, that's just, I just don't like that. You know what I mean? It's just
yes,
like, hey, band X is doing better than we are. We aren't going into the same direction. Kohle, please do that sound. It's boring.
Yeah, and to completely agree with you, it's the same in all genres. Living in Los Angeles, there's a huge culture of writer-producers out here, and some really talented guys and girls that do it. And they're all, a lot of them are multi-instrumentalists, and they're super talented, and they all have home studios, and bands get signed, and then they go around like 20, 30, 40 different writer-producers. And then, there ends up being an album. They pick the 10 best songs from maybe the 50 that are written. And I have a lot of friends that do that, and they tell me that so much of their session is just opening up Spotify and listening to what is a hit at the moment on the pop charts. They'll just go, what's in the top 40? And they want to make sure it competes with what's already out there. But probably the same thing is happening in pop, that's happening in metal, is this sort of, it's hard to break out and be fresh because you're only really trying to do something that's as good as what's current. So rather than sort of being like bands used to be, when we were kids that were, basically in a little town in the middle of nowhere, listening to, a Motorhead record or a Sabbath record and going, I want to do that, and creating a newer version of something classic, So it's kind of a catch-22, isn't it? Because our access to current stuff also is part of the problem as well. They know what's going on. They know instantly. They can't work in isolation. When I was a kid, you used to buy a music paper, you'd read about a band, you'd cycle down to the record store and you'd try to find that band. Usually you couldn't find the band, so you'd end up buying a different band. And, there was just a whole voyage of discovery. And I don't want to sound like the old dude, but I'm just saying we've got to cut to the kids a little bit of a slack. They can find things so easily and so quickly.
I totally agree. Can I just chime in here? Because when I started, that's a story I always tell. I think I spent like weeks and months because I was only reading one German, I think it was called Keyboards, a magazine where they also had some recording equipment in there. And they were all talking about using room microphones on guitars. So I spent a lot of time trying to room mic guitars, and it never worked. And I thought I was young, so I blamed the microphones or the room or because everybody seemed to be doing it. Because I had no friends who were recording metal, I didn't know anybody, and that's just one story. So of course today, people, if you want to produce whatever. South African death metal, I'm sure you will find the 5 other people who do that and in a forum, and they will answer all your questions, and then you can download the right samples, the right presets, the right Kemper pack, and so you don't have to do much to get very close. And I think I lost a lot of time back then, but I also learned a lot.
Yeah.
For me, in teaching people how to do this now, I also feel like I can be a part of the problem, or I can be a part of the solution.
You said you can be part of the problem or solution. You're making a point about how you had to do so many things wrong, but in the process of doing things wrong, you learn new and interesting and different ways of doing it.
It's cool that you don't have, those technical issues anymore. And it's cool that you can just edit stuff. And it's cool that you can record music on any computer these days. So I don't want to go back to my ADATs, and I don't want to go back to tape machines and all that shit, I love digital. It's all nice, but I try to teach people not to get lazy. I always tell them, like, one of the reasons I still use real tube amps over there is not because I think they sound so much better than a Kemper profile or maybe a plugin. But I feel like if I set up a tube amp or several tube amps and cabinets and microphones, I always get more creative. I always spend more time finding the right tone, and I end up with something more unique. Maybe not better, but more unique. Whereas when I work with a Kemper, and I also do that, especially if I have no time, I have a certain tendency to use that preset again because it works. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And that is definitely a very good point you're making there, because and I also have the same sort of upbringing and experience where no info was available when you started out. Basically, I had some really good mentors and teachers, but it was learning by doing for most part, and everything sounded shit back then. End of 90s and. But that's the thing. If you do that, if you get served with everything, then you don't learn how to get there, and that process, there's so much more than just reaching a certain sound. And you sort of only get into that sort of mindset if you have to go ground up with everything, you know, and then you understand better how everything works together and correlates. And that is definitely something that I see, because I don't know if you guys know, but I've also been doing some teaching back in the day at a university in a music production course, and that was very interesting for me to see how these students approach things and to sort of, you know, try to help them with a way of thinking, which is what you do at a university, perhaps more so than in these other type of educations where it's more like focused on working in a university environment. You have to look at the methods instead of the results, right? And that is something that I think is important for people. You know, if you want to get really good at producing or engineering, you need to learn the methods more than finding quick results.
Exactly, and you need the right mindset, and that is work, and experience. But that's what I'm talking about all the time. It's like having the right mindset, and like we talked about that guitar course I'm doing. I was thinking, do people really need another heavy metal guitar course? And I thought, like, yeah, I'm not gonna talk about how to exactly EQ the guitar, how to exactly dial in that amplifier so people can try to copy me and sound like that. I was coming from another direction. So I was creating a song and I was thinking about, okay, what kind of vision do I have for that song? How is that song supposed to sound? And then I get closer to the gear and I try certain stuff and I try to match it with my vision. And so in that course, in the end, it doesn't really matter what kind of gear I'm using. It's the process and the method of, you know, turning a vision into sound, so to say. And I think that is something that people or young people have very often forgotten when they, you know, go through the internet searching for new snare samples.
I heard that sometimes as well from students and from you know, interns that I've been having. It's like, yeah, but what is a good sound? You know, what is the goal? What is the end game here? Because for some, everything could sound bad, and for others, everything was sounding pretty good. And I guess that's the hard thing. Like for us who've been doing this for so long, it's easy, you know, you dial things up, you put it up, and then you immediately go, okay, no, I need to do this and this and this. But it is pretty hard if you don't know or have like a reference point where to get and why you would get there, etc. And I guess in those situations, it actually can help to have some, perhaps like a Kemper profile as a sort of a reference just to get in the ballpark. But if you're gonna get really good at this, you can never start in that direction, I think.
I mean, the cool part is these days people have those Kemper profiles, or IRs are also like a great tool, I think, to learn something about how guitars are supposed to sound, especially in metal where the cabinet is so important. But I think, yeah, people need to get inspired a lot more to, you know, not stop there.
Yeah.
It's interesting to talk about IRs because it's amazing how many, probably like 20 years of like, yeah, it was about 20 years of like Amfarm and Amplitube and all of these different, you know, amp sims that came out. Everybody ignored the impulse response. Everybody ignored the cabinet for so long, and everybody complained about how bad it sounded. And then as soon as you put an impulse response on, you're like, oh, now it sounds real. But it's amazing for how many decades we didn't even put something as basic as that, like how different the cab is. And we all know just changing, just, you know, between a vintage 30 or a vintage 25 or, you know, or just a G10 or a G12, all of these speakers have completely different, you know, sounds that can totally affect the amp. I mean,
I have also like ignored impulse responses for many years, and I don't know why, because it's not a new technology or something. I've ignored that, maybe because I own too many real cabinets and I'm used to doing it the old school way. So I really started getting into IRs when I created my own first IR pack. And that was when I checked out the other stuff on the market. And by the way, Jens' IR pack I didn't like most of the metal IRs I found out there. And Jens' pack was the only one where I felt like finally something sounds great and like I'm used to, hearing guitars or something. So good work, Jens.
Well, thank you.
That was nice, wasn't it? That was nice.
It was very nice of you. I didn't expect that. No,
yeah, you see.
But it's the same with me. I have too much of the real stuff. I wouldn't settle on an IR. If I have set a sound once, I want to move on and do a new sound the next time. But it has been very helpful, especially for me, actually. Like I talked about before, when I start a mix, I might throw something on temporary for when setting the drum sounds and stuff. And obviously then I use my own IRs now with some plug-in, just to begin with. And that would get me so close. So almost every time I mix, I guess like, perhaps this time I should, I want to get home. Perhaps I should just skip the reamping part and use this. I mean, yeah, I'm also, like you said, if I would have known about this 20 years ago and actually been capturing IRs with every production, it would have been so easy, It would have been a gold mine by now. But so I was late on the party. And well, actually the last few months here has been pretty painstaking because I just put out a new IR pack, which is a little bit different because it's the first one I did was about rhythm guitars, which is really hard to get right. And this new one is for lead guitars and clean sounds only. And I thought that would be pretty...
And what's the difference?
Well, for me, it's very different. First of all, I always use a completely different setup when I do, especially lead guitars, because if you would use the same setup as you did for the rhythm guitars, same anything really, but especially the cab, it gets really hard to get a good mix, But if you change the cab, preferably something with a little bit more resonance, perhaps a little more mid-focused, those lead guitars will just sit in the mix so much easier. And I see that all the time, stuff I get in for mixing, people have one setup, they record all the guitars with that, and it becomes a problem, so I always have to reamp that. I haven't really seen an IR pack that focuses around those subjects, so I wanted to try to do the best out of it. And I thought, I should be able to...
It's very smart.
Yeah, I thought I should be able to pull that off, in a few days a week perhaps. But I've been spending so much time on it. And I've been, putting up so many setups. And then I had this big spreadsheets where I finally, when I had, captured like 200 IRs of different setups, I started to do EQ versions of them, and that ended up with such a huge number of different versions. I had to create a spreadsheet, Excel document, and try it out in different scenarios and give them points, and then narrow it down to like, I don't know where I'm at now, like, 70, 80 IRs, leads and cleans combined, which is from these several hundred. So now it's scientifically a good lead pack. I hope, but we'll see.
I'm going to check it out. When I did my IR pack, I was kind of lucky because I was only focusing on 3 EMINENCE speakers. So I was only supposed to use those 3 speakers in that cabinet. So I was limited. I was not, what can I do? And because you had basically millions of setups, right? Anything
yes.
terrible.
Limit yourself is a very good idea when you're going to do a product.
Yeah, my IR pack that I did a couple of years ago is really just the speakers that I use every single day, and I ran it through the processes that I do. But I fully understand the differentiator between lead and rhythm, especially in metal, because the last thing you want on a rhythm pack is an uncontrolled low end. You want low end, but it's got to be really, really featured. And I feel like we sort of swing back to one thing that I think we could talk a little bit more about is, with the mixes, it's like that was part of the issue, was like the guitars were like taking up so much low end, but it wasn't a clean low end that felt defined. And, you were saying, Kristian, on the one that we did a couple of days ago, was the fact that people were taking the distorted bass idea that you were doing on those mixes, but what they weren't realizing was they needed some clean, defined low end to make it all feel like it was tied together.
And another thing there is, when you get that really right, then you get the sensation of a tight, focused, lot of low end. But technically speaking, it doesn't have to be that much low end, because if you go into that territory where it's technically a lot of low end, you will end up in trouble with the YouTube playing, normalizing it pretty low. And or your mastering engineer might, round things off so it's not so fat anymore. So that thing of perceived, defined, focused low end that doesn't eat up too much energy of the master or the mix. That is, too many years of experience, I guess.
I also think that balance between bass and guitars, especially with low-tuned guitars, and they're getting lower and lower, every day. So right now, those 8-string guitars, if you drop them, they are basically a bass. It's an E again. So that is one of the most difficult things to get right, I think. Having that, low-end struggle between the bass and the guitars. And then again, trying to make the bass at least halfway audible, and you mostly do that by adding distortion. And I very often end up with 3 or 4 different bass tracks, one for the dang, one for the oomph, and one for something else. Not to make the bass sound great soloed, but to make it, work with the guitars. And that was one of the main problems in many, many of the mixes that we checked out.
Dave Jordan used five inputs on bass. He had 5. He had a 18-inch sub mic'd by another 18-inch sub. So it just was, using that as a microphone, which is fantastic. He had obviously just a regular amp, like an Ampeg 810 with a mic on it. He had a clean DI. He double mic'd, so he had another mic on the Ampeg. But then he had the night bass, which is the secret to that Alice in Chains bass sound. Remember the SGX? Was it called like an SGX 2000 night bass made by ART? That's that distortion that you hear. Mm-hmm. It's like this rack unit from the late 80s. Mm-hmm. And so he would blend all those elements together, come down the SSL channels, but then EQ them exactly like you're saying, EQ them completely independently. So each one fulfilled a different job. Like, oh, this is my low end. The 18 just go, here's my clean DI, adding in maybe some toughness to that floppy low end. Just get those two together. And then the distortion from, it's the same idea, like blending all of those things together.
Yeah. And but that's also a tip that I guess is, pretty common, but sometimes I see people do the other way around. The same way as I usually track rhythm guitar after drums and then do bass, because it's easier to hear the bass be in tune, and also to find a sound that matches with the guitars. If I get something in where I need to reamp, I always do the guitar sound first. So I start mixing with rhythm guitars, the drums, and then when I feel sort of happy with the guitars and also been having some vocals rocking there, then I start crafting my bass sound always within the mix as well. Because that's the same, like you said there, Kristian, basically if you solo listen, the final bass, it could sound pretty crazy, but it's crafted to, add those elements. That's important, at least in metal. If I would be doing pop, I would be thinking differently for sure. But that's the struggle that we deal with.
I'm doing it exactly the same way and same order.
Yeah, I hear you. Even in like kind of classic rock or just regular hard rock, it's really smart to do the bass after the rhythm guitars.
And in the end, we have to admit that, the bass has, in metal, the bass has more of a function than an actual sound. It has the function to make things sound fat, but the guitars are way more audible, and that makes them more important. I'm very sorry to say that, but that's why I always start with a guitar tone, because that's what's gonna define the overall sound of the production, not the bass tone. And that's why I, adapt the bass.
Do you guys have often do two different sounds. Meaning, let's just say it goes to a verse and the guitar's just going da da da, but the bass is da 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 driving
Absolutely.
through. Okay, so you'll have like a verse sound and then a chorus sound that fits with the heavy guitars.
Absolutely. Usually it's like a with rhythm guitars and without rhythm guitars kind of track, right? So as soon as rhythm guitars are out for whatever reason, I have a new set, completely new mix, basically, of the bass. For drums, it's not so practical, so there I usually automate whatever I need to automate, but it's easier to just do new tracks than automate when it comes to bass sound, right?
I mostly also have like an extreme dirt track, mostly just going through some kind of high gain guitar setup. And that one is just muted or not muted. So in certain parts where things need to sound nasty, I will turn that one on. And then on the clean part, it will be turned off. So I'm mostly muting and unmuting tracks for the bass.
Because we can create this illusion, can't we? It's like with drums, you get like the big drum fill where everything drops out and you can just crank the room. So it's like like this huge drum sound. And then that can come down in the chorus. But in our minds, we've heard that, so we fill it in. So we're listening to the chorus, imagining the huge John Bonham room tones.
It's the same when the bass plays, like in a little break, you have the ding, 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 ding bass break. I always like add all distortion that I have to make the bass sound super nasty. And then people just think like, wow, like so much distortion everywhere. Of course not. But yeah, that illusion.
Same with there's like a guitar break. Left guitar plays over a little break, for example. That usually sounds so thin if you just let it roll. So I usually cut that out, new track, new EQ, make it sound as beefy and cool as possible. And then
the other thing we were touching upon that Jens was talking about in the beginning was, and Kristian as well, you're both talking about the guitar sounds, about getting these guitars to sound absolutely huge and then crafting around it. Because I felt like the other thing that I had a hard time really falling in love with only just a couple of the mixes was the snare sound. I felt like the snare sound was sort of, with the low end, was one of the two things that was suffering the most. And then I started to hear mixes where obviously there was a transient design or at least a compressor that had a slow enough attack time, so you had that snap coming through. And those started to be the ones that I started to enjoy, because either the snare was soft or just too bright to be able to make it feel like it was sitting in the mix. The other thing I was lacking was like ring. I wanted the snare to kind of go clang, because soloed, I think you were talking about this as well, both of you, about when listening in solo is it's not going to help you, because if I listen to a snare that I think is going to work in a dense metal guitar track, it's probably going to be clang, clang, because you put in those heavy guitars, it's just bang, dang, dang, dang. But soloed, it is like ringing, offensive, bright, maybe even a tiny bit of saturation, something to just make it a bit ugly. And then in the track, it starts to feel nice. It's almost like you have to make it, I don't know, you guys tell me, how offensive do you have to make that snare drum to really work in heavy guitars?
As offensive as is needed for that particular product. But it also depends on the pace. Like this was a pretty slow paced track, right? With a lot of room. And then for me, it's nice if the drums are a little longer in their sustain, and usually not with reverb then, but actually with some ringing and stuff. I usually add, sometimes, my goal is always to keep my drums as acoustic as is sort of possible for the current project and the current recording. But I usually have some, like room samples to enhance the room sound of the snare, and also like one sample dedicated to enhance the ringing or extend the ringing that might be even distorted, just so I tune it into the frequency of the original snare, or maybe to the so that it fits the key of the song. And then there might also be some sort of a little pick or crack sound that's just doing the crack. And then if I have those, I can work much more with the acoustic. That's usually sort of what's missing from the acoustic snare. Then I could make the acoustic snare the focus and just add those elements to enhance it, to make the acoustic snare sound much better. Then I don't have to use so much like sample replacement for those elements.
That's cool. What about you, Kristian? Similar kind of approach?
I was ready to tell you all my cool little tricks, but Jens has already said everything I want. But Warren, I'm doing the same thing. I'm always making samples in the session from the tracks we recorded in the session, and I mostly use the overhead and room snare samples, and I compress them heavily or even distort them. I work a lot with that, and because you can just blend them very naturally, of course, because it's the same snare. But you are right about the fact that you have to add a lot of bing and ring and distortion to make that audible in a metal mix. I even remember on this mix, I used some kind of room sample. They gave me samples from the session, so I just used a room sample, and that one was also like distorted, or a Transient Designer sustain on max or something, just to give the snare some, some life.
That's nice. And this is, of course, personal preference that we seem to share. Not everyone likes this. You hear a lot of mixes that would very nice snares, but that are more dry and controlled. But for example, when I sample drums while recording, I always do a sample session as well. I never use a dampening on the snare, even if I have to use like a moon gel while actually recording for practical reason. When I actually do the sample session, I always make sure it sounds as good as possible with a natural ring.
I'm with you here again. I'm always in trouble with drummers because I tell them not to play those overdamped heads, and not to use too much moon gel. I always tell them, like, if you have a snare that sounds bing now, it will just sound bop later with the guitars. But if you start with bop, it will just sound like nothing later. So the only reason for me to use moon gels is mostly if the drummer's performance, if he's like moving too much and like hitting the snare not right into the middle, where you get those nasty reggae effects, bing, bang, bong, then or moon gel or some other kind of dampening really helps. But I'm with you here. I'm trying to make it as open as possible.
Do you think, I think we're sort of hitting on a theme where all of us, musicians, are listening to final recordings where the sounds that they're trying to emulate are blended into the recording. And it's almost not just the sounds, it's the editing, it's the samples that are being used. So they're making judgments based on maybe a drum sound or a guitar sound that they hear blended, and they're trying to emulate that, not realizing that maybe the heavy guitar sound has got some of that clean DI of the bass put in there to make it feel like that. Not realizing that really, that particular, they might think the toms sound quite dampened, but it's my experience that a good tom in a mix has to go doom, boom, boom, but in the mix it goes dum, 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 because all of that ring is soaked up by the guitars. But if you put the dead sound in there, it doesn't go da 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 da. It goes pet, 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 pet. It just ends up sounding tiny.
Exactly. Yeah. It was so nice talking to you guys. We should do that again, I think, right? So talking about metal, talking about mixing, and I love hearing Warren's stories. You have so many cool stories. Thanks for coming to my channel. I see you next time. Thanks, Warren.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jens.
See you. Bye.
I forgot to say see you in hell, motherfuckers. But okay, that's what I always say.